So please welcome Jess Archer.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for pestering me. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Jess Archer. I've been working with PHP and JavaScript for around 15 years. In that time, I've built some pretty cool stuff with it, such as a chemical warehouse management system, a POS system, anti-fraud software for a bank, a telephone robot, a crypto trading robot, and even software for the police. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't do cool stuff with PHP and JavaScript. I'm also a huge fan of Laravel, Vue, and Tailwind. Now, it was only last year that I came to my first developer conference here at Laracon. And here's a photo of me smiling when I got my lanyard. Now, they say that inspiration is perishable, but I swear I'm still running on the seeds of inspiration that were planted that day. At the airport, I literally signed up to Twitter on my way home so I could follow all of the speakers that inspired me. And if you're not on there already, then I would encourage you to come and join us. Just 1 second, sorry. It was through Twitter that I met JMac, who will be speaking later today. And together we started the Base Code podcast. We've done a 10-part mini-series on optimizing code for readability, and we're halfway through another mini-series on automated testing. I was fortunate enough to go to Laracon in New York City earlier this year, where I got to meet a lot of the community in person. And here's a photo of me grinning just after I met Matt Stauffer. And now I'm here, still grinning, giving my first conference talk. Laracon inspired me to build. So I teamed up with a friend of mine to start GiftyDuck. It's a free social wish list and gift reminder service, and it's a Vue SPA that's got a Laravel backend, and it's running on Laravel Vapor. And today, I'd like to share some of what I learned while building it, because there are a lot of challenges that weren't well covered online. So this is basically the talk that I wish existed 9 months ago. And no matter whether you've never used Vue or you're a Vue expert, I hope to have some useful ideas and inspiration for you. Now, I really want to get beyond the basics that are covered extensively online, but I also don't want to leave anyone behind. So super quickly, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I just wanted to briefly explain what an SPA, or single-page application, means to me. So I think it's better thought of as a single full page load application, because after the initial page load, all page navigation and communication with the server is handled via JavaScript and Ajax, and content is swapped out in the DOM to simulate different pages. And why build an SPA? I think the main reason we do it is because they feel more like a native app rather than a website. And I've had non-technical people tell me this about GiftyDuck. And I think the main reason is because you're not waiting for full pages to load and seeing the entire page be replaced, which feels very website-y. A lot of the interactions are almost instantaneous, and when done well, I think it creates a much richer interaction and improves the user experience. It's also easier to share code with other applications. The same API you create for your front end could be consumed by a native app, or perhaps even third parties who might want to extend on your platform. And it might be a bit of a stretch, but I think you can reduce your server load by reducing the number of HTTP requests you make and by moving a lot of your template code to the front end. And this can be particularly helpful if you're going serverless. You might even want to look into something like NativeScript, which allows you to code share between a native app and the web by creating components that have a web template and a native template, but shared logic and data. And why not build an SPA? I don't think one approach is superior to another, and the best approach is really going to depend on your use case. But typically with an SPA, we need to re-engineer things that the browser ordinarily gives us for free with a server-rendered app. Things like loading indications, back and forward navigation, shareable, bookmarkable URLs, the ability to refresh the page, unique page titles, and even authentication. It's also easy to harm the user experience and break accessibility if we don't provide these things or create non-standard interactions without considering the implications, which is true of any JavaScript-heavy application, not just SPAs. It's also harder to optimize for search engines because they're typically going to crawl your HTML and not your JavaScript, so they won't see anything at all. Now, this is not an issue if you're building an app behind a login, but I probably wouldn't build an e-commerce website without some sort of server-rendered version. But I think the biggest issue is that they're a lot slower to build because of all these extra things we need to re-engineer. And because we're basically building two apps. We're building a front end for our users to consume and an API for our front end to consume. And it's also easy to get caught up building these awesome interactions at the expense of not actually shipping. So the first main thing I wanted to talk about is authentication, because this was one of the biggest struggles for me. I started with these two goals, which were really more assumptions. The first was that the SPA should be completely decoupled from the backend and potentially even be in a separate Git repo. And the second was that OAuth 2 and JWTs are the gold standard for authentication, even though the word OAuth fills me with dread from many painful experiences. But here's the thing about OAuth. OAuth is primarily intended for users of a service to be able to give third parties access to some of their data without having to give them their password. It does have authentication flows suitable for first-party apps, but they require the client to hold tokens or secrets. And this is fine for back-end code or perhaps a native app, but when you're authenticating with JavaScript on the front end, it gets a bit hairy because you have to store them somewhere if you want the user to be able to refresh the page or return later. I reached out to Alex Bilby, the creator of the PHP League's OAuth package, which is also the basis of Laravel Passport. He had previously recommended the password grant flow for first-party SPAs, but I wasn't sure how to keep the client secret, well, secret in a web app where anyone can just view the source. I had seen some questionable approaches where people were proxying requests on their server to local OAuth routes so that the web browser couldn't see the client secret, but to me that defeats the purpose of having the client secret, and it just becomes an overly complicated token generator. Alex replied that the advice was out of date and that the current recommendation is to use short access tokens and refresh regularly. Now, I don't know about you, but the thought of refreshing tokens regularly fills me with dread. Sorry, Alex. But it also seems like a really inconvenient way to just shrink the attack window without actually closing it. But it raises the question, why short access tokens and refresh regularly? I believe the main reason is because if JavaScript can access a token, then it can be leaked by a cross-site scripting attack. And you might say this isn't a problem because you've built the most secure application in the world, but what about every dependency you're pulling in, and the dependencies of those dependencies, and then all of the updates they're all constantly receiving? And what about JWTs, or JSON Web Tokens, and the popular JWT auth package? JWTs are a really clever way to do stateless and decentralized authentication, and they're super handy for a microservice architecture. But JavaScript clients still need to hold the token, so they have the same cross-site scripting problems. And also, if you're going truly stateless, they're really hard to revoke. So I felt like I kept hitting walls. Every time I thought I knew what I was doing, I ran into something else. Over and over and over again. I was later comforted to see this tweet from Adam Wathan, where he said he was surprised that he couldn't find a single recommended approach for logging in with an SPA by just firing a username and password over Ajax and getting a token back. He says, how come there's no safe password login flow for SPAs? And I hear you, Adam. So what was my solution? Cookies. I know, revolutionary, right? It's a bit controversial, and it seemed a bit gross to me at first, like some unsexy, old-school technology for server-side rendered apps, not fancy modern SPAs. But they work amazingly well. And that's because cookies that are marked HTTP only cannot be accessed by JavaScript. And browsers automatically send cookies on same origin requests, even via Ajax. So they let you get on with actually building your app while you let the browser at least do some of the things that it's good at. So what are our options? By default, Laravel's API middleware uses tokens rather than the session cookie. So you can't just shove your API controllers in your routes API file and start hitting it, even if you're logged in. You could put your API routes in your routes web file, but that feels pretty gross, and it doesn't let you use your API for anything else. You could change your API middleware to use sessions, but that has the same problems, and it feels even grosser. But there is a really simple solution. Laravel Passport. it's not just for OAuth, but it also does OAuth. Passport has this nifty little feature that can automatically send a JWT token to the web browser in a HTTP-only cookie on any requests via your web middleware. So, for example, a login page. Passport's auth middleware automatically checks for this cookie in addition to the standard OAuth headers. And because your browser will automatically send the cookie and Axios will automatically pass the XSRF token, you literally don't need to do anything on your front end after you've logged in. There's some information on this in the Laravel docs, but if you only want to start off providing an API for your app, you can ignore a bunch of the installation steps that are specific to OAuth, such as the database migrations, the Passport install command with all of the grant clients, and even the Passport routes. The main thing you need to do, which isn't part of the standard OAuth install, is to just include this web middleware. And this is what creates the cookie. Now, this might not suit every use case, but for the majority, I believe it's the most simple and secure approach. And it is still possible to host your SPA separately to your API if needed, as long as you get the cookie domains right. And if you want to use your API for native apps or for third-party integrations, then you've already got OAuth for those situations where it really shines. Just make sure you gracefully handle the cookie expiry. I use a global Axios interceptor to check all error responses for a few typical scenarios, such as the cookie expiry or the app being down for maintenance. I then trigger a full page reload. And the reason I do this is because Laravel will store the URL that the user was trying to access before the problem, and then it'll bounce them to the login screen. And then after they've logged back in, Laravel will redirect them back to wherever they came from. And if your business requirements allow for it, then I'd recommend increasing your session timeout from the default 2 hours so that regular users will still be logged in when they return. And for reference, Twitter sets theirs to 1 month. All right, the next thing I wanted to talk about is state management. So when I talk about state, I'm referring to the variables in your application that are kept between user interactions and events. And if you haven't used JavaScript-based components, you should know that they have a concept of local state, which are the variables contained within the scope of the component, like the Vue.js example here. Data can be passed into components via props from their parent, but props can't be changed inside the child component. Instead, the child component must emit an event with an optional payload instructing the parent to change their data, which will automatically flow back down to the child. This one-way data flow is often referred to as props down, events up. But when your application is composed entirely of components, which is the case with an SPA, you quickly run into scenarios where you need to share state between distant components, and parent-child communication with props down, events up becomes painful. Local state is also lost when a component is not currently being rendered. And with an SPA, you often want to maintain it, such as when you're switching between different routes. So there are a few simple approaches for handling this. But for me, a shared store pattern was the way to go, specifically Vuex, which is Vue's first-party state management pattern and library. There's already a bunch of information on there on how and why to use it, so I wanted to tell you a bit about how I use it with Laravel. All right, so I'm going to do a small demo, but don't worry, there's no live coding. Okay, so this is GiftyDuck. It's pretty straightforward. Across the top, we've got your list of upcoming gift-giving occasions. Then we've got your lucky ducks, which are just the people in your life that you give gifts to. Then we've got your wish list, and then also some gift ideas if you can't think of things to add to your wish list. Now, I'm using Vue's first-party router to handle navigation between the different screens. It allows you to define URLs for your different page components and nominate where in the UI those components should be rendered. It also manages the browser history, the address bar, so you can use the back and forward buttons, and the refresh buttons, or even share or bookmark a particular screen within your app. Now notice how when we switch between each tab, the data is displayed instantly. This is because we fetched all of the data up front and are storing it in a Vuex store that every component can access. For this app, the user's data won't change very often and doesn't get very big, so fetching it up front makes the most sense. But for the gift ideas or when viewing another person's wish list, the data can get a bit larger and it's not controlled by the user. So in those scenarios, we do fetch it on demand and cache it for a short period. We're also sharing a lot of data between components. So if you look on this upcoming tab, we have the list of every upcoming occasion. But if we go to an individual lucky duck, we can see just their occasions. And if we were to update an occasion here, it would be reflected on the upcoming tab because it's referring to the exact same data in the Vuex store. Now, also notice that when we go to these different tabs, we have these image avatars, and they display instantly. Now, these avatar components are actually being destroyed and recreated as we switch between tabs. So the image tag that's displaying the image is actually being removed from the DOM, and then when it's re-added to the DOM, because it's not being displayed anywhere else, the browser has to go and refetch the image. Now, typically this is quite quick because it'll get a 304 not modified status, but there is a noticeable flicker, and it makes the app all of a sudden feel like a website again. So I solved this by fetching the images via Ajax, and I store them base64 encoded in my Vuex store so that I can display them instantly. So Vuex itself doesn't have too many concepts to learn. I'm not going to go over them because we don't have time and it's already well covered. But the point I wanted to make is that it's very unopinionated on how you structure and use it, kind of like a database. And oftentimes, freedom can be paralyzing because it leads you to doubt your approach. Like anything, once you start playing with it, you'll get a feel for what works for you. And to be clear, what I'm about to talk about is not the only way to do things, it's just what has worked really well for me. I like to think of Vuex as an interface to my API and a single source of truth for my client-side data. So I have a few general guidelines that I follow. I only push new data to Vuex from a component when it's ready to be saved to the server. So my form components all use local state for the data that's currently being worked on by the user until they're ready to save it. I place my API requests inside Vuex actions, so there's a single place to manage them, which is kind of like keeping all your database queries inside your Eloquent models. And only once that data returns from the server do I update the state with the data that was returned from the server, which will typically contain extra information such as IDs, timestamps, and maybe even computed properties. This is called pessimistic updating because we wait for the server to respond successfully before we update the UI to reflect it. There's another approach called optimistic updating, where we update the UI straight away to make it feel more responsive, but it becomes a pain if the request fails, so I've avoided that for my own sanity. As a quick side note, I also like to store the timestamp when the data was fetched because of those scenarios where I like to refetch it once it reaches a certain age. Vuex also allows you to group your data and actions into separate modules, which helps keep things organized and maintainable. A module has basically the same structure as the main store, but you can namespace them and then use simpler methods that make sense within the context of the namespace. So for example, you could use insert instead of insert occasion. One of the biggest things I struggled with was how to structure my data in Vuex. With a server-rendered app, every time we load a page, we're starting fresh, and we can retrieve the specific data we need for that page in whatever shape we need it in, because we can directly query the database. Now, of course, with an SPA, we could have multiple different API endpoints, or even use GraphQL to return the data in the shape we need for each page, and then either maintain multiple sets of state or fetch it fresh every time the component renders. But one of the advantages of an SPA is that we're able to instantly load pages without querying the server if we already have the data available and are satisfied that it's fresh enough. And we don't really want to maintain multiple copies of the same data in different formats because we need to make sure that if we update it in one place, that it's reflected everywhere else. So I mentioned before that I retrieve a lot of the data up front. And I don't want to make an API request for each database table. So instead, I return related data nested where it makes sense. So for example, I have an API controller that looks something similar to this that lets me retrieve all of the user's lucky ducks along with each occasion that belongs to it. My JSON response looks something like this, where I've got an array of lucky ducks with each lucky duck having an array of occasions. Now I thought I'd set up everything perfectly for my front end. But no. had really wanted to maintain these relationships in their nested format so I could write code like I would with Eloquent. But I was also trying to store each type of object in its own Vuex module to normalize and encapsulate the related data and logic. I also wanted to easily work with all occasions, regardless of the lucky duck they belong to, and have the ability to retrieve an individual lucky duck or occasion by its unique ID. And this just wasn't realistic with nested data. I learned that a big part of SPA development is data manipulation. After all, Vue is a data-driven framework. And a common but seemingly unspoken practice, at least in my circles, is to flatten your data on the front end. So here's what that flattened data might look like. There are a bunch of different ways to get the data into this format, such as having your API return the data already like this, but I like to return a pretty typical Laravel response and instead convert to the structure I need for Vuex in Vuex itself. Now, no matter which approach you use, there are a few important points to note. Different types of objects have been unnested into separate top-level entries, and in reality, I'd put each of these into their own Vuex module, but I wanted to keep this example simple. Instead of storing the objects in an array, I'm storing them in another object with the unique IDs as keys to make it quick to look up by their ID. And we can still use object.values if we need to access them as an array, and I typically have a Vuex getter to do this for me. I also keep the ID as a property on the individual object as well, so that I can still access it when I'm dealing with the object individually. And finally, I can still access the related data by keeping references in each location. It wasn't the exact solution I wanted, but it was definitely the one that I needed, and it made my life a lot easier. And you might also want to look into a third-party package called Vuex ORM, which implements a similar approach. All right, the next thing I wanted to talk about, I'm calling modal back router hack, which is confusing. So let me quickly demo what I'm talking about and then explain how it's done. So if I go back to GiftyDuck, if I click on the Add Lucky Duck button here, it opens a modal. And if I type in a name, such as Taylor, and press Next, and then if I go and use the Browser's Back button, it'll take me back to the previous screen. And if I press back again, it'll close the modal. And I'm not using routes for the modals because I don't want them to have their own individual URLs or to appear in the browser's history. So typically, with most apps you've probably used, if you press the back button while a modal is open, it'll take you back to the previous page, which can be really frustrating. Now, on a desktop, this might not seem like a huge deal, but if we switch to mobile view, a modal like this is typically full screen. And with phones having back buttons and like back gestures, I think people expect that if they were to press back here, they'd go back to wherever they were beforehand. So I've achieved this using a Vue router navigation guard, which is a bit like route middleware in Laravel. Now there's a little bit to unpack, and the syntax is a little bit gross, so I'll quickly break it down. Keep in mind that this needs to run every time your modal is opened. My modal components are instantiated every time I display them, and then they're destroyed when they're closed. So I'm using component lifecycle hooks. If you're showing and hiding yours with vshow, then you'll probably want to add a watcher on the piece of state that's controlling it. Now, just ignoring the variable definition at the start for a second, to the right of the equal sign, I'm calling the before each method on the router and passing in a closure, which will be our navigation guard. Vue router will call this guard before it performs any navigation, such as the user clicking on a router link or pressing the browser back button. And in our modal, there are no router links, so the only possible route navigation is the back button. Inside the closure, I'm calling a back method in my modal component. Now, this might simply close the modal, but it could also be a bit clever. So in the example I showed you, if you're on the first step, pressing back closes the modal. If you're on the second step, pressing back takes you to the first step. And if you're on the last step, which is just a confirmation screen that the record has been saved, where I don't really want you to go back to the previous screen, pressing back just closes the modal. After that, I'm calling this function that Vue router has passed to us. This lets us control whether the intended route change will go ahead. And by passing false, we're effectively preventing the router from doing anything. If we look back to the top, the before each method returns an unregister function, which we can call when we're ready to unregister our navigation guard. So the last step is to register another callback that will be run when our modal is closed, which calls the unregister function so that the router guard doesn't continue to intercept routes after the modal is closed. Now, on the topic of modals, I really quickly just wanted to mention modal focus management and accessibility. Now, I don't know nearly enough about accessibility as I should, but I do know that the ARIA accessibility requirements say that when a modal dialog is displayed, the keyboard focus should move to the first focusable control inside the modal. And if the user tabs through to the end, focus should wrap back around to the first control again. In other words, focus should not leave the modal. Additionally, when the modal is closed, focus should be returned to wherever it came from before the modal was opened. So, for example, the button that triggered the modal to be opened. Now, this sounds pretty painful to implement, but it's very important for accessibility and for anyone else that navigates with the keyboard. Thankfully, there's a package to make this simple in Vue, and probably for other frameworks too. You just need to install the package and then wrap your modals with this focus lock component, and it will handle the rest. So there shouldn't be any excuses for not doing it. Okay, so when a server-rendered app loads, the browser is able to start displaying page elements quite quickly because the DOM elements are part of the initial page response. However, an SPA can't render anything until the JavaScript and the components have downloaded and initialized because they are responsible for creating the DOM elements. So you'll just be staring at a blank white screen for a moment, even after the browser's loading animation has finished, which gives a sense that something might be broken for that split second, and that's all it takes. Now, we can drastically improve the user experience while the page is loading by displaying a loading animation. These have been shown to drastically reduce the perceived loading time of a page, even if in actual fact it slightly increases it. One really easy way to do this is to put your loading animation inside your main app's components slot, which will just be treated as a div until Vue has loaded. And as long as you're not actually using the slot content in your main app component, Vue will automatically remove it from the DOM, doing all the hard work for you. I would strongly recommend using inline SVGs and inline styles in your HTML for this though, so that the loader is downloaded as part of the initial page response and it can be displayed instantly without having to download any images or style sheets. There's no point trying to digest everything here, but the main thing to note is the use of inline styles for positioning and animating the SVG. And then I've defined a simple keyframe animation at the top of the page. Now, supposedly, the more unique and interesting an animation is, the better job it does at reducing that perceived loading time. So it might be better to skip Font Awesome and perhaps reinforce your brand by animating your logo. So this is what I've done for Gifty Duck. Now, no matter how cool your animation is, you don't want your users staring at it for more than a second or two if you can help it. And one thing we can do to reduce this loading time is to reduce our JavaScript bundle size by being mindful of what we're including. For example, if you're using moment.js, you can save a ton of space by switching to day.js if you're able to, which has strived to maintain the same API at a fraction of the size. Some features need to be pulled in via plugins, as you can see here. However, that one change alone reduced my minified bundle size by 261 kilobytes. And I was able to shave another 18K by only pulling in the Lodash features I was actually using, rather than the entire library. In this case, it does change the API a little bit, as shown in this example, and it does break the chain method, but there are some workarounds for that. So this brings me to the end of my talk. I just wanted to mention some notable Laravel-based alternatives to building a full-blown SPA. Because if I was building an MVP to validate an idea, I probably wouldn't do an SPA, just because of how much upfront work it is. Now, firstly, I still think server-rendered apps are awesome and the best fit for many applications. But I also wanted to give a mention to Inertia.js by Jonathan Rennick, which Frank told us a little bit about this morning, and Livewire by Caleb Porzio, which he introduced at Laracon in New York. Now, if you wanted to take a closer look at Gifty Duck and see what an SPA can feel like, then register for free at giftyduck.com, and I would love to hear your feedback on it. I hope I was able to teach you something new or inspire you in some way. There was so much more that I wanted to share, so please let me know if you're interested in more material like this. And follow me on Twitter at Jess Archer Codes, and feel free to ask me any questions about anything you saw here today. And be sure to check out the Base Code podcast. Thank you.